Hi, everybody. We put you in the shade today. We thought it was better. Yes, it's beautiful. Thanks again for coming to LongHouse. And I can see some of you were here for yoga and walking meditation this morning and then came back. We're so glad that you're here. This is the third season that we've been doing what's called Long Island Modern. And I have to say, with Alastair Gordon, who needs no introduction, those of you who've been here with us before, I love the flexibility of the way that this has gone. I was saying to people this morning, you know, it began about Norman Jaffe. It began to be about houses that are being torn down on the East End. And then when Alastair's really generous about including other people in what we thought this should be. And when he said airlines, we jumped at the chance. The East Hampton Airport has, where's Phil? Phil's going to come up and talk about that a little bit, the East Hampton Airport project. Also, we love when it ties back to LongHouse. Jack Larsen, among many other things, was one of the participants in the 1970s. We say, remember when airplanes were big and colorful and branded? Some of them still are, and the interiors were gorgeous, and the seats were, there was a Calder plane, and there was a plane that Jack Larsen did for
Braniff.
For Braniff. We'll hear about that. So it's particular to us as a place that we feel like a place of wonder, a place of awe, a place that is really about design in nature, design in architecture. And I think I'll sit down and listen to Alastair. Thank you so much for being here. There's water and chamomile tea from our own garden in the back. It's a hot day. I'm sure Alastair won't mind if you get up and if you're thirsty, please drink water today. It's really hot. So there we go.
Thank you. Oh, a little applause. Everything. Thank you, Carrie.
You're welcome.
Carrie just came back from some. Where did you come back from? Ljubljana.
Nobody knows. Ljubljana is in Slovenia, and it's I'll say I was there. I was 3 years ago invited to be the guest curator for something called the Well-Being Project, which held a summit for 1,000 people on concepts of well-being. I feel like being at LongHouse really situated me quite beautifully to be there to talk about wellness in the workplace, wellness through arts, how important it is to take a walk. I mean, nothing new under the sun. But it was beautiful. Ljubljana is, Chris just said, what did you say, goddamn Ljubljana? Yeah. No, but it's this funny place where the history is, it's got a storied past, but it's the former Yugoslavia. So it's that part of the world, it's that part of Europe. And it's bordered by Hungary, Germany, Italy, and Austria. And all four of those cultures it's hard to find what is Slovenia. You know, there is a local culture, I won't go on, but it's sort of pertinent, and the design is interesting, because sometimes you feel like you're in Vienna, and then you go out, and the menu is like goulash, and then there are a lot of Italians there, so a real melting pot, and it's mostly tourism right now, so I was there it's really fun, totally exhilarating, and I'm really glad to be back here today to be continuing, I would say, the work of wellness, which is sitting outside, listening to a smart man give an entertaining lecture. What could be better?
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you guys for coming. Can you hear well in the back?
Yes.
Because sometimes it sucks. Yeah, okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Carrie. And this is a kind of a stretch, you know, because when I first mentioned it, they went, okay, sounds interesting. But there is actually kind of logic to the illogic. You know, we really wanted to start, and I kind of run through almost every lecture I'd ever done on Long Island modern, you know, period. So I hate to stretch. I did a book about this, you know, about 15 years ago. So what I find always interesting is how do you tie in the mission of LongHouse and what Carrie and everyone here is doing, which I think is so important, you know, and kind of turning it into what could be the design museum, not just for Long Island, but potentially, you know, the East Coast or America. America doesn't have a lot of great design museums. Canada does, Montreal, the CCA, Canadian Center for Architecture, you know, there's several in Europe, and there's just not a great one here. You know. But what I learned just from messing around a little bit was how involved Jack Larsen was with aviation design And he was pulled in by, first of all, Edward Larrabee Barnes and Charles Forberg. Charles Forberg designed and built this house. Forberg also did several other projects in East Hampton. He did the Jack's studio in New York. He did the Electric Circus. He did the design for that stretchy fabric, which I think that's how he met Jack, actually, because Jack knew this new kind of stretchy fabric that they used to be the psychedelic light shows. So around 1958, Pan Am had a fairly kind of dull, graphic design template, and so they brought these guys in for what was called the Globe livery, and it was going from a kind of a darker blue to a much lighter, that's classic, sky blue, Pan Am blue. That's a scarf that I actually found at a museum in Miami, which has a lot of the archives of the Pan Am. And that was, I don't know who designed it, but it's so cool. It was a scarf that the stewardesses got around 1958, 1956. Sort of, like abstraction of Pan Am's world roots, because at the time Pan Am was it. I mean, they had the largest network, of world. So this is work that Jack did for Pan Am, and it was for the first Pan Am 747, 1969, 1970. He called it Pan Am Stripe. It was a woolen twill, kind of blue and green. Then about the same year, about a year later, Braniff was so interesting because it was kind of a fairly everyday Texas-based airline, and this woman, Mary Wells, who was a kind of, did anyone here know her? Because she was kind of a major, did you? Yeah, Bob? She was incredible, sort of like out of Mad Men, she was this incredible genius on Madison Avenue advertising. And Braniff just wasn't doing very well, so they figured they couldn't really expand their roots very much because it was sort of limited. So they thought, let's have a whole makeover. So Mary Wells had this idea. The end of the plane was the campaign. She said, I saw Braniff in a wash of beautiful colors, and it really worked. It brought Braniff out of the blue. She also, so this wasn't a guy who invented this. This was Mary who invented the air strip. That was kind of the ad campaign. Well, she realized that 90% of their passengers were men, were either salesmen or businessmen on their way to kind of jobs. So she created this thing. I mean, it's not that different from what every stewardess does. You have a coat when you're in the winter, and then you take it off for the takeoff, and then when you serve the meals, you put something else on, so on and so on. But they really pushed this as a kind of sexualized thing, and Pucci, then she brought in Emilio Pucci, and we have a representative here today. Sabrina, yeah, stand up, Sabrina. Sabrina wore her Pucci especially for us. Thank you, Sabrina. She was trying to make me wear this absurd Pucci hat and a scarf, but I looked like a charwoman from, east side of London. So he, I mean, it was this amazing convergence. So he not only did the famous print of the woman in the engine there, but those other kind of bodysuits he also did, which are kind of, I can't see the screen from here, so I assume you're seeing that. And these were some of the swatches that Alexander Gerard, I'm sure a lot of people here knew him or knew of him. Incredible designer, he did everything. He was head of Herman Miller's textile division, worked with Jack Larsen a lot, and these are just some of the swatches. So the idea was just to create this very kind of lusty South American vibe of bright colors, which at the time airlines were not using at all. And Jack came up with, for their first 747, the Braniff first 747 was this worsted wool jacquard, woven in horizontal strips. Yeah, and there she is in her Pucci skirt and Jack's chairs. It was even featured at Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris when there was a retrospective of Jack's design work in 1981. They recreated some of those chairs on the right there. Pucci's famous, globe helmet for the stewardesses. And Gerard, this is the only picture I've ever been able to find, a decent picture of Love Field, Dallas, which Gerard also did that. So these are the baggage carousels, which are so cool and kind of psychedelic. I think they were orange and red, the colors, something like that. This I didn't really want to show, but I felt in the interest of being a thorough cultural historian. Jack also did the carpeting and textiles and curtains for Richard Nixon's Air Force One.
Wow.
And which didn't really lead him to great heights of stardom, but that's all I know about it. I don't know much more, but those are some of the photographs I found. So to tie all this together, I actually, and we have a great guest here, Phil Smith, who won, Phil and his partner won the East Hampton Airport competition in 1989. Wow. It's a long story. You know, their design unfortunately wasn't built. But because of that, I was in Washington, I was in New York doing research just to write a brief about, you know, the culture of airports. And it can be such a banal environment. And I thought, you know, as a cultural historian, I thought, well, I have to breathe some kind of life and humor and you know, creativity into this story. So after we did the competition, and it was sort of a heartbreaker, but it was an eye-opener too, I realized that no one had actually written a decent cultural history on the airport, which I found kind of amazing. So, you know, 10 years later, of course, I was able, after a lot of research, I did that. And I'm going to sort of very quickly go through just some of the interesting things that I, you know, came across. It's such a highly designed environment, and now we're so, you know, shackled by security and just all the paranoia of traveling. It's become such a horrible thing. But if you think of that period, especially after the war, and especially when the first jets, the Boeing 707s came in, and that whole jet world and jet setting came in, it was so sexy and so alive. It didn't last very long, but it kind of, you know, I love this quote. I opened my book with this quote: "In the main passenger terminal, chaos predominated. Arthur Haley's Airport, 1968. Then looking for, I always try to find a poet or someone who's got, you know, a special sensibility writing about a place. And Franz Kafka went to this air show and just, you know, and was kind of depressed by it and called it an artificial desert, which I love, that Kafka, you know, Kafkaesque airports. And he actually has a quote about him. Stephen Spender going out to one of the early British airports called The Landscape of Hysteria. And Rainer Banham, a brilliant English critic, called it a demented amoeba, especially the way just airports keep, you know. And then people get critical because they're tiny when they're built. Then all the suburbs kind of morph around them, and then everybody's angry because they want to shut the airport down, and then everybody's angry because the airport can't expand, and it's, you know, it's sort of a very impossible kind of conundrum. Any technology gradually creates a totally new human environment, said Marshall McLuhan. That's the great famous tube at TWA terminal at JFK that Eero Saarinen did. It was the only thing he hated about the plan, by the way, these tubular appendages that, you know, were necessary just to get out to the planes. So he was always looking for alternative ways. I'm gonna shoot back really fast because we don't have that much time. Imagine World War I, the trenches in Italy, actually, northern Italy. Erich Mendelsohn was in the German army, that's him there. He was in the trenches on one side. And he was dreaming of this new city that was very much built around, this is actually a terminal for airships. But he dreamt of this entire city that was sort of shaped by aviation in the future. You know, this is 1914. The other side of the same this is true. The other side of the same battlefield was Antonio Centella, who was a great the Italian futurist architect. Every generation should build its own city, and he had similar kind of plans for a city. Here's his central station for Milan, that had, if you can see on the kind of back center part, that's the airport in the middle of the city. You know, so the trains are running through it, and there are buses coming through, and then airplanes landing. Of course, it's completely absurd. It became a huge part of the whole futurist movement, this idea of, I mean, there was aero poetry, there was aero painting, partly because of Mussolini, partly because of Marinetti. This was all, you know, evoking the sense of speed and the future and mechanized life. And I love these paintings by, Virgilio Marchi, who was an architect. And he'd flown all around Milan and Turin and done sketches, and these are buildings as seen from a passing airplane. And it kind of gave this new dimension to architecture. You know, you'd see it from above, you'd see it in passing. You know, these windows open like kind of human mouths as he flies around. And there was this thing called aeropitura, which was actually practiced by this one guy named Verossi, but there were several, you know, who would, you can see the guy on the left, he's sitting in an airplane painting, you know, a scene from the airplane. You know, I can't imagine the pilots, you know, spilling, you know, oil paint and turpentine all over his dashboard. And of course that then morphed into the early fascist, you know, much more aggressive kind of image of aviation as you know, a militaristic thing, which we're now doing in Iran, unfortunately. Marchi then developed this whole idea of the future as modern city. Again, it's all built around, all the buildings have airfields on the top. He was actually commissioned to do a new airport for Rome, right on the Tiber River, Palazzi dell'Aria, around which the new Rome, again, this was very much in Mussolini's bag, never was built. But the idea was, it was very much, they didn't know what an airport should be. You know, they thought of it as more like a railroad station. So here's Marchi's sort of idea of the planes would be pulled in on tracks into these sheds, you know, which would be a lot like. Same in Russia, there was, you know, the futurist Russians and the constructivists like, you know, Kazimir Malevich. Here's a design for a pilot's house, Rodchenko's design for an airplane. This incredible, it took me years to find this the Malevich design for an actual airport in 1924, you know, which is like one of his paintings, but it's actually a layout for an airport. This was one that was almost built, Soviet Palace of Labor. Of course it wasn't built, and with this crazy thing on top that was for airplanes. Lizitsky did these cloud hangars, which are so cool. And the idea was you take elevators to the top and the airplanes would land. Of course, all this is pretty absurd. This is probably the most absurd of all, which is Le Corbusier, who had never been in an airplane when he designed this. So it's a city for 3 million, you know, as he says, a city made for speed is a city made for success, 1922. So the central station, right in the midst of these, you know, very high towers, you know, you had to land, right? You had to be very careful. Imagine the accidents on the thing. But he had no idea. So it wasn't until about later in that same year that he presented that. He was invited to do a submission for the Moscow, I think it was the Center of Culture in Moscow in 1928. So a few years later, sorry. And he actually flew on a commercial, Lufthansa had the most developed network in Europe at that point. So he actually flew from Paris via several stops, you know, to Moscow, and he just raved about it. He couldn't believe it, and he called it chronometric exactitude, you know, that it left exactly on time, you know, better than the trains. And then he was particularly impressed by this was the summer flight plan for German airlines, you know, very organized, very impressed by that. Then people like Lowell Thomas, aviation in America in terms of commercial aviation was really behind Europe. Mainly because they didn't have, you know, federal funding from the central government. It was state by state, it was municipality by municipality. So Lowell Thomas was, you know, was a famous journalist. You know, he wrote the book on T. Lawrence of Arabia. And he was always flying all over the world. He was trying to show Americans that you could actually, on commercial airlines, fly all over the world. And here's his wife getting out of a plane from Berlin to Paris to catch a plane for Africa. There was a beginning. Hans Wittwer, not that well known now, but he taught at the Bauhaus. And this whole Leipzig airport is interesting because after World War I, there was a section of Germany that had to be given back to, I guess, to France, I think. But they had to, you couldn't take a train across that section, you had to fly. So there was a real need for a new airport. So Wittwer designed, the idea was to have everything as transparent as possible. So you'd sit in this restaurant and waiting area and you could see the planes coming in. Again, this whole nature of you know, transparency being something very virtuous. Nothing could impart greater confidence than for a person to see airplanes arriving and departing frequently without confusion or accident, one of the magazines wrote. This is a famous, Hamburg kind of in a way was the first really developed terminal idea, because you could see on the top was one of the biggest problems was people came to the airport all the time to see the planes, to see famous pilots, to see famous celebrities arriving. And it was a real problem in terms of circulation. So Driesen and Evenhoff, architects, figured this whole system out. So you arrived and you went through a central thing. No one was allowed in there except for passengers. The sightseers were restricted to that top level. So it was kind of designed like a stadium. Hitler loved this airport. He thought it was really cool because it's sort of, you could have these spectacle shows there and you could have the crowds on top. Schiphol in Amsterdam also, which was completely reclaimed from the water. There had been that poster shows a ship in the background because there was a famous Dutch versus the Spanish ship battle right where the airport now is. Schiphol, that's what it's called, Schiphol. And there's the famous restaurant. It was one of the first kind of really fancy restaurants in an airport, and again, it's all transparent, so you can sit there having lunch or dinner, and you can, the visitors who remain in comfortable restaurants while observing the airplanes as they alight and depart are certain to become patrons of the air transportation lines. By this time, Corb is, he's obsessed with airplanes and everything to do with aviation, sees it as a key to the future of the city and architecture. He fills his, the pages of Esprit Nouveau with aerial views. The airplane is a symbol of the new age, he says. The airplane arouses our energies and our faith. He goes to South America. He's invited by the Brazilian government, which is on a very kind of, new modernist jag, getting all these famous architects to come down. And he's flown around by this famous French aviator, Jean Mermoz, but also Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who was a good friend. And he starts to do a master plan for Rio de Janeiro from Mermoz's plane. And that's a sketch he did from the backseat of this biplane. And he sees it all as, the conception of a vast program of organic town planning. It came to me like a revelation when he was up in the air. And then he developed that further. Of course, it was never done, but the idea was to have these raised highways and trains and these new buildings outside the perimeter of Rio de Janeiro. And again, he got all this from this perspective. He wrote this book, which actually, strangely enough, came out in English before it came out in French, 1935, Aircraft. Sort of most of the book is aviation porn, to be honest. It's these sort of close-ups of propeller, very beautiful photographs of propellers and fuselages and stuff. And also these just aerial views. The airplane indicts the city. When you see, now we look at those and I think that it's kind of beautiful, but he looked at them, saw it as just chaos, terrible, messy, diseased, darkness, all these medieval kind of adjectives he would use. The pilot's eye can see the chaos of the old city, he wrote. Then some people were already realizing you had to go way out of the city. This is Gatwick's original terminal, which is actually there still, which is cool. They've preserved it, which usually these older terminals are just torn down. The idea was to, I don't have a pointer, but, oh, maybe I do. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, okay. So this was the train station. You get in Victoria Station, London, take the express out to the Gatwick stop. This was the tunnel here. You'd go directly from the train stop through the tunnel, then up through here, and then out through these telescoping boarding ramps. So it was kind of the first, realization. Here are the telescoping ramps. So on rainy English weather, you could go from the train to the terminal to the plane without getting rained on. That's the interior there. It was called the Beehive. It's been very nicely preserved. Ramsgate Municipal. Again, usually the airplane itself was the metaphor, the trope that architects played with. This is a beautiful terminal. It's still there in Venice. San Nicolo del Lido Airport in Venice. Mario Emmer, who was a kind of a fascist architect in 1932. But, good designer. Good fascist, good designer. In Italy, everything is good. Whether you're fascist or a communist, it's good design. It's the Great Tower. Again, Castra, which is probably the most sophisticated pre-war Wilhelm Lauritsen, who's an incredible Scandinavian modernist. He did this thing with this flow. A certain festive optimism that is linked with things in the process of development. This sort of undulating ceiling, everything kind of worked. The baggage came in there very, very quickly. Again, this has also been beautifully restored. And you can get, if you go to Copenhagen Airport, you can go and see it. They've sort of preserved it. Same period before the war, Le Bourget, which is where Lindbergh landed in 1927, so it's, it took on this incredibly famous aura of futuristic kind of aviation. By this point, 1937, it's the biggest airport in Europe by far. Again, you can see on the top level there's this crowds of people. Again, they could isolate the non-paying passengers up there, and I think you had to pay, like 10 francs or something to get up there. This huge hallway, kind of, spooky. And that's it. Allied bombing in 1943 almost destroyed the whole airport, but that's just one shot I found. But it wasn't German bombing, it was Allied bombing, 1943. Then it was rebuilt after the war, but pretty soon it was supplanted by other airports. This is just quick word. Nervi was sort of one of the few, in Italy who understood the possibilities of concrete. It is reinforced. They couldn't use steel because, they needed steel for armaments for the war, but they could use a minimum of steel reinforcement in these incredible concrete things. And of course, I can't not mention Tempelhof, which was Hitler's airport. You can see on the left image there, the swastikas on the planes. And this was actually partially based on LaGuardia Airport, which I'll mention in a minute. I can't really dwell on this too much. This is right after the war. The French, it was part of the Marshall Plan. They had this kind of symposium in Paris with architects and city planners to try to figure out how to rebuild Europe and how would you rebuild, train stations, airports, everything. So Le Corbusier, who got the most attention, gave a talk about what the future of the airport should be. The beauty of an airport is in the splendor of wide open spaces, he says, and illustrated his talk with these rough sketches of an ideal airport. So the idea is the machine itself is this glorious kind of beast, mechanistic beast on the thing, and the terminal barely exists. It's like a whisker, kind of almost all subterranean, with glass, and the passengers look up to these wonderful machines. And then this is where I got the title for my book and the title of this talk. An airport should be naked, he said, whatever that means. But I think what he means is, it should have just the minimum of everything. Totally low-level glass and steel, deferring to the beauty of the actual transportation device. An airport should be naked. Now we go to North America very quickly. I'm kind of moving on pretty fast. I love this shot. It's just I'd say, before they had proper signaling, these guys with these giant flags. This is Newark Airport around 1920. Around the time that Lindbergh actually flew from Roosevelt Field on Long Island. So, I have to begin with this and go back. So really, a more sophisticated level of airport and aviation technology in America didn't really start till Lindbergh made that flight in 27. As I said before, there was no federal funding, there was no centralized funding for aviation. So it was all spotty. It was like airline companies would have their own airports, like Ford. Ford had his own airline company, and he had to build his own airports. I think Henry Ford built like 3 or 4 airports, and that's kind of limiting because then you can only go to 3 or 4 airports. So when he came back in he came back as, we can't even imagine. It's like the Beatles mixed with, I don't know, some famous sports star. He was so huge. This is before he became a Nazi himself. And he basically, almost more incredible than the flight to Paris in 27, was he flew all around America to like hundreds of towns and cities and basically preached commercial aviation as the future for America. And the only really good airport, the only comprehensively designed airport at that time was Ford's airport in Dearborn, Michigan, by Albert Kahn. It had a real waiting room, and it was, the planes were separated from the passengers. Guys used to walk into, propellers and, get decapitated. There were a couple of examples of that. So it was all about safety. You could fly in a Ford plane. They were tri-motors, so they had 3 engines. So one could die and you could still fly. I think even 2 could go out, you could still fly, or still land anyway. Meanwhile, all these, utopian fantasists are coming up with, it's in America, it's so much about how do you get an airport in New York City, So it was there are hundreds of these proposals for airports at the top of buildings, and then this guy on the right, he was obviously a cartoonist and joking. That's the municipal building downtown in New York. Like, you just put some nets down and the planes can just flop into the nets. This is a typical of the period. You know, like it's a train station basically. They don't quite know how to think out of that box. This is an ideal airport. It was never built. Austin Company built a lot of airports though over the years. One of the more interesting things, Frank Lloyd Wright's son, Lloyd Wright, entered the Lehigh Cement Company had a competition in 1929, 1930. And his was really the most interesting concept. You know, it was based in, because he flew a lot and he worked for the Boeing Company in Burbank. And he, you know, figured out everything about that plan is based on the, you know, the angle of ascent of airplanes, the speed of airplanes. So he was very clued in. Of course, nothing like it was built, but it's kind of a beautiful concept. And then he did do a design for the Boeing airport in Burbank. This is, you know, Norman Bell Geddes, who was kind of a madman, utopian designer, you know, industrial designer. These automated air terminal number 1, he did a whole series, including this crazy thing at the base of Manhattan, because, you know, you still had to go into the wind to take off. So this thing could rotate at the base of Manhattan, and you know, it really would be great. The reality on the ground was kind of interesting too, but not so sophisticated. So if you wanted to fly from New York to San Francisco or New York to Los Angeles, you could go on this company called TAT, Transcontinental Air Transport. They didn't fly all there were about 14 stops you had to make because you had to refuel. So what they did is you would leave New York, and I think Cleveland, yeah, this is Cleveland. So you get to Cleveland, you can see the plane, the tri-motor plane, and then the wealthy passengers would get out, and if you could see kind of to the left of the terminal, there's a train waiting there. It's a high-speed express train, you know, with beds and a real dining car and everything. You'd get out of the airplane, and they didn't want to fly at night. They didn't think it was, you know, because it was dangerous. So you'd get out of the airplane, then get into the train. All through the night, you'd be going on the train. Then I think you'd get to Chicago. In Chicago, you'd get back on the plane for the daytime trip. Kind of amazing. So there's one of the routes that's from New York to San Francisco. And what's cool is when they did start flying at night, they built these towers. This is, I think, recreated. I don't think that existed. You know, they saved it, but there are these nerdy aviation dudes who I meet every once in a while. They go across the country looking for those concrete pointers, because you just go through, you know, if it was foggy or anything, you'd have to fly really low, and then oh, there's Phoenix over there. And then you can see each beacon, I think it was every 50 miles or something, there'd be a beacon with a bright light on top. So, you know, like a lighthouse, you know, for ships. In that tiny little house, they all had little numbers and little tiny cottages like that, and a guy would, you know, sit in that cottage, and then you had the pointer telling you how to go. Most of the airports were built by local municipalities, and then when FDR came in, there was WPA money for the building. So, and they tended to be very regional. This is El Paso, Texas. This is Burbank. You know, kind of like swashbuckling, Spanish style, Spanish architecture. Romantic, like in fact, they used a couple, not this one, but one of the airports that looked like this was used in Casablanca as the Moroccan airport. And then these interesting guys who were seeing it more like as if it was Versailles. You know, from the air you'd see these great geometries, and it was like laid out like a landscape. Fairfax Airport in Kansas actually was laid out like a formal, huge formal garden. This was one of the most interesting early terminals by Delano and Aldrich, you know, who were very well-known architects of the period. He did a lot of big houses in Southampton and Rhode Island and places like that, but they also they actually designed LaGuardia, the first LaGuardia. They also did the second big airport in Miami, which was Dinner Key, which is for the floating, the flying boats that would go down to Havana. I mean, this was hugely profitable because you could, you know, during Prohibition, you could fly from Miami to Havana, drink all day and night, and then come back. And they had a special deal for drunkards. That's the interiors, and that became, you know, One Trip's logo, the huge globe in the middle of that's the Miami terminal. Then, you know, then we shift to, you know, the beginnings of FDR and WPAs. Mayor LaGuardia was very good at getting money out of FDR. You know, FDR liked him, you know, and kind of approved of his energy and his mayoral skills. And somehow he convinced him to pay for this, you know, so it was the first federally funded airport in America. That's pretty conventional. The North Beach, it was called North Beach then, the terminal by Delano and Aldrich. Fairly conventional, but if you can see on the layout here on the left, that curve, so the H's are hangars, stand for hangars, and then you have the terminal that we just saw in the very middle, and then that curving line is like very, very important, because it becomes something called the skywalk, and in a way this is the first kind of, you know, kind of engineering, technological, and architectural appendage, you know, where they really, the engine, I don't know who, and I looked through all these documents in the Port Authority archives for who actually designed this thing, because in a way they were the most brilliant futuristic designers. So the idea was you could suddenly have, you know, 20 aircraft come up to that structure. Again, the top was for sightseers, because it opened 39, the year of the World's Fair, so there were all these tourists from all over the world. They came out just to see the airplanes coming and landing, so they had to stay on the top. That cost 10 cents to get on the skywalk on the top. Below, it later was glassed in, was where the passengers would get out, and they would be led by the pilot or stewardess to the main terminal, and they would never have to rub shoulders with the hoi polloi, you know, and of course a lot of people know that this is the Marine Air Terminal. Local, again, a local connection is our friend James Brooks, you know, such a great painter. Has, you know, had a studio in Springs. I used to have a studio out in Montauk. And he did this incredible mural called Flight in 1938 that's been beautifully restored. If you're at LaGuardia, who wants to hang out at LaGuardia? But, you know, there is a great restoration of the lobby there. And the mural goes all the way around the rotunda. It's pretty amazing. Very much WPA period. To the jet age, you know, I think this is interesting, because we all suffer through JFK, right, more than probably most airports. The beginning was Wallace Harrison, who was so much in the driver's seat at that point. I mean, he married at Rockefeller. He was doing Lincoln Center. He was doing the United Nations. He was in charge of all these big projects. So they kind of flipped Idlewild, which then became Kennedy. I'm sure a lot of you remember going to Idlewild. I do as a kid. 1946, so he came up with this idea. It was a 2-mile long, it's sort of this baroque, you know, almost like I don't know what it looks like, but that curving thing around, the undulating thing around the periphery is called the peripheral building. It's 2 miles long. The idea was 86 planes to 90 planes at a time could unload. And then in the center, at the very center, let me use my little thingy, this crossway was the central terminal. There are these huge escalators, so you'd come in from the highway, and then you could enter the main terminal. And he was way ahead of his time, because he forced you to go through a whole shopping area, you know, like a high expense shopping area. So, of course, this wasn't built, but this was, you know, again, this vision that there's the restaurant, and you can see the peripheral. Out the window, you can see the peripheral structure and the planes, and you'd sit in these multi-tiered restaurant and watch the planes come and go. Of course, that didn't work out, and also they realized the jet hadn't really come around yet. So by '58, they rethought it altogether. And a guy named Harrison, what is his first name? Sullivan. I'm sorry. Sullivan came up with this concept. Again, what they didn't like, the corporations, the airlines didn't like the idea of a centralized, very European kind of, here's one central terminal where everybody's processed. They wanted their own terminals, and that, of course, is the beginning of what was the disaster of JFK and that whole way of thinking, which soon people realized was completely outmoded. When this was presented, it was like, now the airport is a city unto itself. It's the airport city. Idlewild was called the Seven Wonders, because there were going to be seven. So Eastern, Pan Am, TWA, National, United, I don't know if I'm probably forgetting one. And this crazy thing in the middle that didn't last very long, this Liberty Plaza. So the idea was that people would be escaping communism. They'd fly into JFK and they could hang out, you know, at this park, like who wants to hang out at an airport park? But it was these long, totally based on Versailles, the layout of Versailles, which I find fascinating. And then in the middle of, and this again was Wallace Harrison, In the middle was this Liberty Fountain, which I think it only lasted like 5 years because they needed so much parking. So, they pretty much paved over the whole Central Park. But it's kind of cool, that they thought of that. And, at that point they had 3 chapels, again, it was a total city. There were restaurants, there were all kinds of, things for people who were not necessarily flying. The first really spectacular terminal was built by Walter Prokosch, 1959, 1960. Again, the idea was this huge kind of umbrella that stretched out. So the planes would go under that overhang. It wasn't great because, you could, if it was bad weather, snowing or really windy, you still got kind of soaked. So that kind of went out the door. This is just, I just love this photograph. It's such a great this was a combined terminal, Braniff, Northwest, and what's the last? I think it was, Northeast and Northwest. Yeah, there were 2 different airlines, that's right. And then, the most famous, I think, building there and architect, of course, is Eero Saarinen. There he is on the floor underneath his model. Kind of, he would stick his head up through the bottom of the model to get a feeling for how the TWA terminal would flow. The idea was, he was on the jury in Sydney, Australia, for the Sydney Opera House. And he'd arrived, I don't know if this is apocryphal, it might be apocryphal, I don't think it is though. He apparently arrived late in Sydney, and everybody had already rejected, 90% of the entries for the Opera House design competition. And he went through them, himself. He went, hey, wait a minute, this is it. And he pulled out Utzin's, Utzin's proposal, which was the one that ended up being built. And he convinced him that this is, even though it was incredibly expensive and almost impossible to build, that would put Sydney on the map. And of course he was right. So on the way back from Sydney, he's flying on Pan Am. He's got, one of the new menus with that global graphic on it. And he's sort of, there are 2 versions of this. He's either unpeeling a grapefruit and cutting it in these kind of sections, or he's drawing on top of the Pan Am logo, which has those kind of sections, similar kind of sections. He comes up with that amazing design. This is how it was built, which I find incredible, because it's so, now it'd be all computer technology. It was just, formwork and scaffolding and bits of wood and casting one bit at a time. We wanted an uplift, he said, a place of movement and of constant transition. That's a famous photograph by Ezra Stoller, which really gives you the feeling of that place when it opened. Yeah, I remember, and I begin my book about just remembering taking my cousin who was going to fly, who's Scottish and was flying back to London, and we went to this terminal, and it recently opened, and it was just it made such an impression, much more than the World's Fair. The World's Fair seemed kind of dated already, whereas this thing was amazing, with the sexy red carpets and the stewardesses and these handsome pilots walking around. Everybody's in red and. But it wasn't loved by everyone. Louise Huxtable, who was writing for the New York Times, the modern traveler fed on frozen flight dinners enters the city not in Roman splendor, but through the bowels of a streamlined concrete bird. And I think she later kind of retracted this because it's such a cool. And as most of you, I'm sure know, now it's a hotel. Owned and run by JetBlue, which is pretty cool. So that's one way to preserve. Terminal preservation. Talk about difficult. That's probably the most difficult of all because you're constantly knocking everything down. And in a way, she was right. It became just this big advertising sign for Louis Vuitton or whatever this ad is for. I'm not sure what it's for. Again, this is so interesting. I.M. Pei, very early in his career. He was invited to do one of the terminals, National Airlines, which I guess National Airlines doesn't exist anymore. But their main passenger group was to go to Miami. They basically were the Miami, New York to Miami kind of airline, and they didn't want the same as the Saarinen. They didn't want to compete with all these swooping, soaring kind of bird-like forms. So he came up with this kind of neoclassical idea of this pavilion with this huge. Incredible kind of cantilevered roof and these almost bone-like columns, which later just became straightforward concrete. They didn't do that, the shaped columns. A soaring airport is getting to be the most in of all, quoted Time magazine, 1960. This is Las Vegas, but there are about 30 I could show you of this period where they're trying to kind of imitate Saarinen. And this is Saarinen himself, which is, it's such a brilliant idea. Dulles International in 1962, just 2 years after the Kennedy and the TWA. And in this case, what he learned from, and what I said earlier, he hated those tubes that took you out to the planes because it ruined the sculptural integrity of the actual building. So at Dulles, he thought, I want to just make this beautiful slope, swooping pavilion. And that's when he came up with the idea of these there you can see one there, right? I forget what they're called, the terminal buses. So, I'm sure you've all flown from there. It's kind of annoying, and they're kind of ratty, and now they're ratty and they break down all the time. And but that was the concept. There it is. There, it comes up, and you arrive there by car. You go through, but he didn't want to mess with just the architectural volume itself and the beauty of that. They were called mobile lounges. Sorry, I thought. Departure lounge on stilts and wheels, and it would raise up to the level of the airplane when it went out to the field. There were so many problems with this stuff. I don't know what they're doing. Again, sort of the central. Yeah, this is LAX. How do you find yourself in the wasteland of Los Angeles? And this was commissioned basically to give some kind of central theme. But if you here, and I love this picture. I can't resist a good airline uniform picture. But this layout is so interesting. So there's the central theme building there to give some kind of sense of center, but I don't know who ever used that or uses it today. I think it's a restaurant today. But these sort of Valium-shaped boarding pods, out here, and again, in the bottom you can see you would arrive, you'd go through this tunnel to one of these pods, you'd go out, go up the escalator. The opening scene of The Graduate with Dustin Hoffman, he's actually arriving in LA from, where did he go, Princeton? Did he go to Princeton? I think he went to Princeton. And then he's like, looks like a mutant coming along there. And that was pretty interesting. And that's one of the pods. So this was a different concept that a lot of airports started to play with, which was put everything underground. And so you don't get any of that, that architectural or sculptural kind of sensation. So the walk was so long to these Valium pods that they hired Lucille Ball to inaugurate the Astro Way at LAX, 1964. This is the American Airlines version. So she put on her white high heel shoes and her best white gloves to show that it wasn't dangerous for women to ride on the Astro Way. And then she kind of burst through that piece of paper there, as a publicity stunt. And here we're moving to the much more intellectual European sensibility of the airport. No less than Roland Barthes says, he was invited with a lot of other writers and journalists to go on one of the first jet flights out of Orly. And his experience was the jetman is defined by a co-anesthesis of motionlessness. And excess of speed turns into, guess what? Repose. That's a big deal. So Paul Andrew, who I got to know before he passed away, kind of amazing. I mean, he was a real genius airport planner, and he was the head of the French National Airport Division. And he did Charles de Gaulle, and it was directly in response to that, not directly to Barthes, but to the idea that in jet air travel, you barely know you're traveling. You're so high up, you're so removed from the earth, you don't really get a sense of movement. So his idea with Terminal 1 at Charles de Gaulle was to reinvent the sensation of the excitement of air travel. So similar kind of pods to LAX, but in the center, this wonderful vortex thing, it was called the Central Vortex, 1974, that's a sketch for it, very much coming out of, earlier kind of ideas of Piranesi and, these multi-level, and I'm sure most of you here have gone through it, and the first time I went through it, I remember going, this is the most exciting thing. So you see it there, people are coming in from all these different boarding pods, and then they kind of swirl together in this wonderful, and you see each other, and you don't know are they coming in from Africa, are they coming in from New York? With the fountain in the middle, it was kind of brilliant. There. And then I'm going to skip through some of this because we're going. So this is a great story. The same guy that laid out Kennedy Airport was asked by the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport Commission to come up with a new concept because all these other concepts were kind of dating themselves so quickly. You know, and some of these airports became literally, you know, unusable like within a few years of opening. So Sullivan had seen this ad for Hertz Rent-A-Car, where the guy, I don't know if you remember this, the guy gets out of the plane and then he floats into a convertible, do you remember that? Yeah. And he floats into the convertible car and just keeps driving. And the commission said, this is what we want. You know, you want to go from the plane to the car as easily as that, you know, the guy in the Hertz car commercial. So these endless kind of circles, corrals is what happened with Dallas-Fort Worth. And the idea here was, as you needed to expand, you could just keep going down that central line and add another kind of corral, and it would keep going onto eternity. Paul Andrew, who I mentioned earlier, the French designer, had to face the same thing because the Terminal 1 at Charles de Gaulle ran out of room very quickly, and he did Terminal 2, which a lot of you probably have been through. And this, I don't know if it's worked in the end, but the idea is that, again, you just keep adding kind of new sections to it. And it's a great quote. He's a very smart man. Terminal 2 has continually been the object of development, transformations, and additions, to the point that this project, more than any other, has come to contain time within itself. Not time from an historical standpoint, but time as a constituent element, as a subtle material on par with other building materials, which I love that quote. And, you know, the idea of incorporating time as a building envelope. Everything changes in the late 60s, early 70s. There are a ton of, this is before real heavy terrorism, but there were a ton of hijackings to Cuba, as you probably remember. And LaGuardia, this is the first kind of metal detector that they installed at LaGuardia in 1972. And the New York Times did a whole spread about how fashionable it is to kind of walk through, and do you strut through, and they made a kind of, somehow a funny, cool lifestyle story out of it. Each passenger going through the TWA security tunnel has his or her own style. Paul Virilio, another French heavyweight philosopher who I kind of love, as the last gateway to the state, the airport comes to resemble the fort. The new terminal at Miami in that period of, you know, because they were kind of getting directly hit by the hijackings to Cuba and from Cuba. So they hired these guys who were professional, I forget their names, I don't have the note here, but they were known for doing high security prisons. And they did that plan, which is a new terminal in Miami. You know, and there was hardly any, there were like tiny slit windows, you know, thick concrete walls, were kind of brutalist. Midfield complex, Atlantis, similar, I mean, just kind of a nightmare of continuity. I mean, I think it's the biggest airport, I think it is the biggest airport in America. This is interesting, the last from the ground up airport built in America was 1995. Curtis Ventress's design for the Denver International Airport, which is kind of amazing. So there just isn't room anymore to build a new airport. In China, they do it because they have vast spaces that haven't been developed, and they also have, you know, workforces that they can control. So that's kind of the end of the idea of architecture as a way to solve the problems. Curtis Ventress's idea was to, you know, like at least symbolically, to, you know, echo the Rocky Mountains in the background there. And this photograph shows that. I took this photograph in San Francisco. I love that they're now, you know, this place that used to be so filled with anxiety and speed, you know, they're yoga rooms, now they're meditation rooms. I actually did a little yoga in that room. It was quite nice before flying back to New York. It's so ironic that these places of transition and speed are equipped, you know, for now downtime. So San Francisco they put in a beautiful bamboo grove. You can go and meditate. You know, Singapore has the famous butterfly garden, which is very relaxing. There's some Chinese gentlemen taking it easy in China. Then, you know, the ultimate Dubai, you know, luxury shopping thing. That's what you know. You can either have massages or you buy very expensive jewelry. So this leads us to somehow brings us back to East Hampton, and I would love to invite Phil Smith, a great architect who's with us. You want to come up and sit beside me?
Sure.
Yeah? It's okay. That's Queen Ali Airport in yeah, do we have the other microphone?
Yeah, but I like your...
Oh, that doesn't work?
No, it's all right. Go ahead. Continue.
Yeah, no. Okay, so...
Talk over your shoulder.
Okay. So, to bring it around full circle, in 1989, the town of East Hampton was, was getting these kind of nasty letters from the FAA saying, you better, fix up the airport. The terminal's gonna, someone's gonna die. So, it's rotting. It's like really in bad shape. You got to rebuild something. And I was trying to do affordable housing with the town and would meet with the town board. And I think it was Tony Bullock turned to me one day and he said, "Hey, how about Alastair? How about doing a competition for air terminal?" And I stupidly said, "Yeah, okay, that sounds cool, And that's how I got into the whole airport thing. So it became kind of a big deal. We had over 100 architects from all over the place submit. There I am with bushy hair, and I still owned a tie then. And the Times, we got too much publicity, to tell you the truth. And we had some great, there are a couple of the designs. I think that's Frank Israel. Can you see it from here? Here, you can look in here too, yeah. And that's Ed Mills. Yeah, Ed Mills. Yeah, Frank was great. I love that plan. I thought it was cool. So I mean, all this wonderful work was coming out for this dinky little airport. But people, I guess the architects figured all these celebrities and East Hampton billionaires were going to come through. I love this one, Barbara Marx. I don't know how you would build that, but kind of interesting. And then we come to my very good friend Phil Smith here. Hand of applause for Phil. I have everything. So Phil, just so I go. Hello? Here you go. Phil. Hello? Mike.
Yeah, I hate to hold and talk at the same time.
The mic has gone off.
You turn it off.
Well, then we have to use this one.
No, I'm sure it works.
Be able to talk at the same time. Hello, everyone.
Okay. So this is your first sketch, I think, or one of your early sketches, which is so beautiful. And I handed over. Yeah, here you can see it from here. So just to back up a little bit. So we had a very distinguished jury, and the town signed a.
Name them.
Well, can you remember them?
Charles Gwathmey,
Jordan Gruz, and
Suzanne Stevens.
Yeah, it was amazing. Suzanne
Critic,
Stevens. Yeah.
Record magazine.
And Peter Peterson of Cohn Peterson Fox.
And,
very
and the
distinguished.
manager, the guy in charge of the airport.
Yeah, the manager of the airport.
Skinley?
I can't remember his name.
I
I
think
can't
his last
remember. So pick it up. What were your ideas when you kind of entered the competition? What were you thinking about?
What I'd like to do in defense of architecture and myself is start with a little bit of personal information and professional information. I first knew the East Hampton Airport from flying in and out of Nantucket to it, because my partner had grown up in the summers in Nantucket, and that was a place we escaped to from our work in Manhattan. As we moved along in time, it got increasingly difficult to do that. And it so happened in 1985, we finished our first commission out here, which is in Wainscott Hills, which overlooked the airport, out of the flight pattern, and high up, and we could see small planes landing. In 1987, we started our own home out here, having come to know East Hampton more through our relationship with the client and the project in 1985. I grew up in Charleston, West Virginia, and our first airport was started in 1950, and they had to cut off the top of 3 hills and fill in 2 valleys. There was a joke that you had to fly up to it to get into the airport. It's still there, but I had the privilege of being able to watch and knew the architect that designed our first terminal, so I've had a lifelong kind of association with that. I was also a signals officer in the Navy on the Forstall in the Mediterranean for a couple of years, and I saw flight ops. I learned a lot about that. I had a view from the conning tower. I was in control of a lot of things, so I had another romantic and professional link with that. So we'll move on to competitions, and in Alastair's later slides, as time went on, there were competitions for airports, but all were larger affairs.
But this is the one you asked about, right? Is it that one?
Yeah, well, and the photograph is the dark blue one.
I have here, of the model, I mean, yeah. That one.
I think that expresses things more.
Yeah.
But competitions have been a long honored way of architects, yes, you're hoping maybe to win a competition, and sometimes you're already successful and you just continue, but sometimes it's a major breakthrough, just like an Academy Award or something, if it gets built. That wasn't really, in this case, the energy behind, I think, most people's entries. It was a small airport, aside from famous people flying in and out or not. It was small, it was of a nature, it was a manageable exploration thing to do in your office. And my partner and I had decided, when we started our office in 1974, that every 2 or 3 years, we would include a competition in our process to let everybody that worked with us and ourselves explore territory untethered to anything except the brief of the competition program, and to have a different experience, a laboratory kind of situation. So when the East Hampton competition came along, both in our own backyard and from my history and love of different experiences growing up, how could we not do this competition? We had done 4 or 5 other large competitions in the years before. One small one for a county courthouse in Monroe County, Pennsylvania. But we just had to participate. And I think in truth, that was true of, in 100 entries, there were at least, I had 3 or 4 friends that were very, very talented architects in New York that entered. And the discussion was really fun. It wasn't about trying to just win. Of course, you always hope to win. But in any of the arts, if you're really trying to do your best work, you try not to guess what winning means. You try to do your best, most interesting discoveries and solutions. So that's where we started.
Phil, can I just add one thing there?
Now I can speed it up.
Okay, no, not speed up, but to put into context what you're talking about. One of the things that came up almost immediately was, and it's very much about that period and what this whole series has been about, the modern vision versus, whatever traditional is, and of course, we love traditional architecture out here, but it raised the specter of that. Instead of keeping it low key, which I should have done, it became this big argument between, no, we want a traditional airport. What's a traditional airport?
And that wasn't, we've had many discussions about this over the years, but I think my real take on it, and I'll come to that in a second, but Alastair's brief for the program and phraseology in introducing the competition to would-be competitors was very poetic and very scaled in discussion to rural accessibility and friendliness, and not, trying to create LaGuardia Airport or something like that. Very much scale and thinking oriented and landscape oriented. And, and in the brief, which I'll come to about how it got out of control in the conversation, perhaps that's what you're referring to. But let's go back to the beginnings. One of the things that was a little bit unusual about this particular brief was the jury, and we prefer nowadays to call them reviewers or selectors, but it doesn't sound so pernicious. But it was set so that the town board of East Hampton was 5 people. And it was stated in the competition brief, it took 3 of them, a majority, to select one of the schemes of the 5 finalists, of which we were one of the 5 finalists. And we each had to go before the town board, explain our projects, and we were selected. Now, simultaneous with that happening, it was an election year, and Wainscott Citizens had a citizens committee, already well in place to stop any expansion of the airport. Because for 2 or 3 years, it had been discussed that the 1936 terminal that was there had been a sawed-off piece of an army bungalow from World War II, or World War I, that they had located there, and it was falling apart. And the federal administrative FAA said, you're going to lose your airport, you're going to have to close it if you don't improve that terminal, you have to extend the runways, and you have to bring this up to standard. So there were a lot of people wanting to go forward with that because East Hampton was one of the first 2 airports on Long Island after MacArthur. and not counting New York City. So it was a major point of access for a certain population. And the Citizens Committee, especially Wainscott, but Southampton oriented as well, were really irritated by the constant flight pattern over their houses, because we go out over the ocean circle to come to that airport. So there was already an inbuilt local kind of animosity towards actually hoping to maybe close the airport.
Yeah,
So-
plus Trump was trying to
Yeah,
have his
still-
helicopter service come in.
Yeah.
That didn't help us.
And it's all still going on in some ways. So then, unbeknownst to you or any of us participating, the fine print, the FAA was going to pay for construction of the terminal. And we were all asked to give an economic study of our scheme also to see how buildable was, what the cost would be. We actually consulted with Bing Kropinski, the late Bing Kropinski, who helped itemize and put a number on our scheme, which was below the budget. It was right there. The FAA was going to pay for part of it, but the town had to come up with funds. So it went for a town referendum in that November election.
Yeah.
And that's where the trouble really started, because there was one group really trying to stop anything from happening, another group trying to find ways to help that, and another group is really in favor of building the airport.
But the anti-airport people basically said your taxes are going to go up, which wasn't entirely true. And so people just came out and didn't even know anything about it and voted. It got shot down. How bad a
And now,
defeat?
that was the headlines in, I think, Dan's paper, where the airport restaurant goes down in flames or something like that. And I think
Dan was against
it was
it the whole time.
312 votes to 292, I think it was, or something. A surprisingly low turnout in a very close margin. But the real hitch was that in the fine print, in the town legislations, it required 5 members of the town board, 4 members, a large vote, to have any funding for the airport. That made it have to go to vote, because 2 town board members would not sign on to any new terminal. So that was the really beginning of what then became very partisan politics and a lot of
Kathy Lester. Let's
negative
name the
comment.
name. Yeah,
A
Kathy.
lot of people pro, a lot of people for. On a good note is we were asked by the town to build a very large scale model.
Which we have here.
Yeah, and
This is shown in the.
that was, it's like 7 feet long and this wide, and we had a lot of fun doing that. We went to MoMA and looked up in their catalog of projects that they have, and could find a real model of Villa Savoye. And it's always dangerous building real life models for clients, because it's better to talk a little abstractly if you can and try and explain all this, but the gravel, the colors, and it fit, that particular project fit our concept of the airport. And the town paid us for that. They reimbursed us for that model. And it was displayed in True Value Bernie's hardware store on Newtown Lane in East Hampton. And people, we got a lot of feedback from it. It was a very, very interesting process.
But it was depressing in the end, though, because
But
it was
yeah,
such a great opportunity, and you guys did so much amazing work, really incredible work. The thing I want to ask you about is the way this became a divisive, kind of argument between, like, as if it was about, traditionalists versus, like, they kept saying, like Dan's paper would always say, the avant-garde New Yorkers are coming out and forcing modern ideas down. There's such BS, and it was, if an airport is not modernist, what is? Right, it's the most modern form of transportation. So it was just ridiculous. We didn't know a lot of what you're talking about. There was that Pete Petrie or some guy in Wainscott.
I won't name his name, but that's
I name names. I name names. I always name
Well,
names.
that's an interesting thing to bring up, because he had just had Robert Venturi,
He was
the wonderful, magnificent architect, and his wife Denise Scott Brown, design a house for him in Wainscott in 1982, right in the flight pattern. And that project is now approaching, it should be saved. It's one of Venturi's best projects. I
Tell
think.
me what you and Doug learned. Despite the heartbreak of the political fallout, but what did you guys learn in the process? Because it was a long process. You had to really.
I'll do that if I can have 1 minute to explain the genesis of our scheme.
Okay.
So you go back to the model,
Okay.
the first
The first model.
Yeah. 1946 sketch by Cuvier that Alastair showed. I've known that.
The naked airport, yeah.
The naked airport, yeah. The airport should be naked or whatever.
Yeah.
I first knew of that sketch in my first year of architecture school at Columbia. It's when I didn't run into it before that. And subliminally or subconsciously, when we started this project, that sketch, a line in the field, a demarcation, you arrive to it, you depart from it, was our concept. It would look just innocuous sitting there in the field, very quiet. A 200-foot long arbor, that's what you see there,
Right.
in steel. And a waiting room, a nomadic tent, a central space, and an outdoor waiting room on the other side.
So I showed the
Behind it.
the room.
Yeah, that's the waiting room, and it has an outdoor porch with retractable awnings on it also, and a sunscreen over the glass roof. It's about the size of this. That's another point. There was a lot of talk about the gigantic airport. It was 4,200 square feet. That was the
Which is
plan.
tiny.
So that's the average size house now. And in fact, someone said it would make a really nice house once you sold it to a client and have them build it over there.
I would like it.
So really, transparency, you can see right through the terminal. Security was at a different level still then. And the Casablanca porch that you referred to as there in this side of the left side of the scheme, because they wanted people to be able to arrive when the terminal was closed and still have a place under cover to wait for people to pick them up and or have baggage delivered under.
Didn't you want to have wisteria growing up the trellis?
Yeah.
I mean, it was such a
It was
beautiful.
meant to have vegetation growing
Yeah,
on.
beautiful idea.
So it was really a long 200-foot white steel arbor with vegetation, a waiting room behind it with a cedar-clad sunscreen around it, and the conning tower like I had on the ship in the Navy. But that was required in a program with, for some reason, only 270-degree view. We made ours look to be 360. But that was it. And then quietly on either side of it, cedar-clad infill boxes for the various programs like ticketing, auto rental, and that, a very modest thing. So that's what it was. What we learned from this was nothing.
Good answer.
Continue on, we didn't stop doing competitions. There was a long history of competitions, winning scheme not being built. We weren't hugely surprised once all the political fallout started happening because of the flight pattern, the funding. And certainly, one of the town board members that was against it would not sign off was quoted as saying, "I hate architecture." So he wanted a Butler building, and Butler building from any educated architect's point of view is architecture also.
Yeah,
It's one of the
they're beautiful.
great contributions to architecture. And so that kind of insanity was going on. And I think really to have the privilege of working with someone like you and the support system, even as we all went through
We
that
learned a lot.
negative process,
We became friends.
is what we learned was to keep doing our best work with the best people we could. And I honestly can't say anything other than that.
Yeah. I can say that the day we learned that the referendum was shot
And we got a
down-
lot of publicity out of it.
With ton-
Actually, in
ton
our
of publicity.
portfolio, it's been very good. It helped with other professional, not so much residential projects, but other, like the Tibetan Museum of Jacques Mercier, Tibetan Museum on Staten Island. We've been their architects for years. We're actually very moved by this scheme because it also came into expanding their facility, but with the original faux Tibetan Museum very much intact as a central core, like the middle of the airport, things like that. So in the long run, it's a very positive experience and very difficult at the moment.
Yeah, well, what we learned, very clearly was that there's not a tradition in this country of getting great architects or younger architects. You go to Austria or even France, Germany, the Netherlands, yeah, a little bit. I mean, but there's a tradition in Europe and in Japan too of when you have a new, especially a publicly funded building. In fact, they insist on it in some countries that you have a competition. It's a way to move architecture forward. It's a way to move urbanism, but also bring young, talented architects into public view. And it is very hard here, maybe because of publicity, maybe because there's no tradition of doing that here. You have to go back to WPA practically.
Yeah,
But anyway,
it might have something to do with gun control. in some strange way.
In terms of what?
Gun control.
Oh, okay, that's
They were
that's
very,
interesting.
we just have a different mindset on things like that. And in fact, the American Institute of Architects has an ongoing conversation, and I'm always part of that as part of the National Committee on Design, of whether young architects, it can be called architect abuse, because you do put a lot of time and energy at no compensation.
Yeah.
So they don't recommend not doing it, but they think you should think hard before you do and choose your competitions carefully, research the brief. And if you have your heart in it, do it, but don't just do it necessarily to try and think you, because the odds of winning, you're competing against your fellow peers, and many of them just as talented as you are. We all think we're the most talented on some level, but you get a lot of good feedback.
But it is a brutal
And
process. It is a brutal process. And I remember once a doctor said to me, like, why architects go through that crap? Imagine being a surgeon saying you compete for, open heart surgery or something.
Yeah, it's like the second opinion is where you get a chance. The more, one last note on that is that the more known avenue now is an invited competition, so people can submit credentials to be available, but then a panel of architects advisors for the client will narrow that down to 5 or 6 people to do a study and a design scheme.
But they get paid.
And pay each of those people for their.
That's much more fair.
So this conversation will be going on forever between having no competition, open competition, or an invited competition. So
on that note, Phil, thank you so much. Phil Smith, thank you very much. And thank you all. Thank Carrie. Thank the LongHouse for this series. It's a great opportunity to express ourselves.
And I want to self-congratulate or whatever.
Okay. Go for it.
I know the Naked Airport book. I know Alastair's other books. Alastair has done a wonderful book on Doug's and my work called Quality of Duration, a magical title which only Alastair could come up with and describes our process.
Very glacial.
But looking at his slides, I think there's no one does it better in terms of a descriptive, sharing, entertaining invitation to a new field or whatever you're looking for more information about. You're just unparalleled.
Thank you very much.
Are you taking questions?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you want, do we have time? Is it okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Q&A. Any Qs or As?
Thank you, Phil. Phil, stay up there. There might be questions for you.
So how did the present terminal come into play?
Oh, I don't know if I want to talk about that. Do you want to talk about the present terminal? He asked about the present terminal. So basically, the dust settled after the competition, and then it was just like back room, like how everything is done. They just got an architect. He was about the only architect who hadn't submitted a plan to the competition. I mean, it was so typical. It was just, it was unfortunate. We were like naive puppies, in the face of, the whole thing, which I find embarrassing now. But
Well, they did have, what happened, the dust settled, and then 2 years later, the FAA was still closing in on them, and they decided they had to go forward with a terminal of some kind. So then they put out an RFQ, request for qualifications, and we refused to disappear. We actually had no interest at that point in having our scheme built, but we just felt like, why not continue the conversation? So we were in discussion with them, and they selected us as one of the 10 to submit a new design, knowing we would not be chosen because of I think we really understood that. But the architects they chose to do it, my understanding, I know who it was, and a very capable person, they did build that scheme. It's about the same size as, it's your program.
Yeah,
it's just the
same
three.
program,
And
but not nearly as good. I mean, you're
I'll get a little cranky at this point, but his plan does look very similar to ours, but cranked a bit.
Yeah.
But it's really an original piece. And then it ended up in lawsuits because of construction cost overrun. Nothing against the architect, but it got so difficult in 2 years before it was finished and open that architect left town and now lives permanently in Minnesota or something. But it's just part of local law.
But listen, let me say this, self-congratulatory, as you said, your plan was so beautiful, and it would have just been a great plum for the town to have. a terminal like that. And whoever goes there, I can't afford to fly down from there, but you know, it would be cool to have it. And you just did a beautiful job. And the idea that just because it's flat roofed is somehow modernist or anti-traditional is so nonsense. I mean, garden pavilions, you know, whatever, are very similar. So you know. But we learned a lot, and you know, you move forward. And thank you. Any other cues?
Alastair,
Yeah.
Yeah.
are the other entries for the competition archived anywhere?
Sort of, you know, I wanted to do a book and I never got the fun. I mean, I have a lot of them. You know, we held, I think for 10 years I held on to the, you submit these boards, those 30 by 40 pounds.
And you know
And at a
that,
certain point they start falling apart, and I think, unfortunately, I documented a lot of them. Yeah, I don't have all of them, but probably 40 of them. 30.
that's an interesting question too, actually.
That is a good question.
In some way, some version of the airport competition should end up in the archives here. It's already, I know now that one of the
You can have
first,
it. I have
one of the 5 finalists is in the Cornell Architecture School archives. Our scheme and backup and drawings is in Columbia Avery Hall archives. They chose it for their permanent archives. But there's still many available, and if you ever create such a thing, I'm sure Cornell and Columbia can tag into your situation also.
It's a great idea.
It's a very good question about
Yeah.
where is this material.
Do you have a, talking about current airports, do you have a particular favourite in terms of design? And just briefly also what you feel about the redesign of LaGuardia Airport. Do you think that's a good redesign?
Yeah, I mean, I know so much about LaGuardia, the history of it. It's hard to. I mean, it's better than it was. Yeah, you do. I know you do.
I fly in and
But
out of LaGuardia all the time.
answer the first part. You know, what I learned from doing the book was really design. You know, with a capital D in the biggest sense, isn't necessarily like the shape of the terminal. Like in a way, I fly into Amsterdam a lot, and Schiphol's just so beautifully run, and it's so intelligently run. That's what you care about. I mean, whether it's in the shape of a mushroom or, you know, a toadstool, whatever, you know, it's not as important. Yeah. I think that's it. But anyway, thank you guys. Thank you.